You are listening to Off the Shelf, a podcast by The Conference Board.
Hello, my name is Ataman Ozyildirim, Senior Director for Economics at The Conference Board, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a book discussion series brought to you by The Conference Board. Today, I'll be sitting down with John Guerard to discuss his latest book, The Leading Economic Indicators and Business Cycles in the United States, 100 Years of Empirical Evidence and the Opportunities for the Future. Welcome, John. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ataman. It's a pleasure to be here.
So right off the bat, let's start with talking a little bit about your own interests and involvement in forecasting generally and leading indicators in forecasting models.
Absolutely. Thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. And I've been doing economic forecasting for about 35 years. I spent the last 17 years as Director of Quantitative Research at McKinley Capital Management in Anchorage, Alaska. And in that capacity, I also served as an associate editor of the International Journal of Forecasting. And I served on the IJF board since 1992. So I spent 30 years there, and I overlapped with the previous Director of Quantitative Research at the Conference Board, Victor Zarnovitz, who brought with him and enhanced the leading economic indicators. So Victor and I served on the IJF board for about 15 years together. So I've had an interest in forecasting for over 35 years, both professionally for my work with the Q Group and my research in forecasting earnings, and with forecasting the leading economic indicators.
That's great. And you have a long history working in this area, and you know a lot about forecasting and leading indicators. And you're also the author of several volumes on corporate finance, portfolio allocation.
Yes.
And I encourage everyone to take a look at John's bio and see his publications. But this latest book on the leading indicators and business cycles in the United States, what brought you to it? What's your motivation in writing this book?
Well, I have to tell you, I've been interested in the work of Wesley Clair Mitchell, the first NBER director, and the author of 3 or 4 volumes on business cycles, first in 1913, second one in 1923, 1927, and 1946. I've been interested in him since I did my master's thesis in economics at the University of Virginia, and Wesley Clair Mitchell was one of the authors that I was doing research on at that time in a different monetary theory capacity. But Wesley Clair Mitchell developed the whole notion of business cycles, which if you may have forgotten that business cycles were the first area of emphasis at the National Bureau of Economic Research. That's where all their leading volumes started. And it was always interesting to me because the leading economic indicators were supposed to measure a general barometer of business conditions, economic business conditions. And they were supposed to tell us which way the economy is going. I think that's so critically important because of the fact that when you look at the leading economic indicators, Wesley Clair Mitchell was one of the first Americans to talk about the different cycles of business cycle, prosperity, how prosperity, when it goes beyond prosperity and people's expectations become wildly divergent from reality, that leads to crises in terms of the liquidation of bank loans, and crises eventually turn into depressions. And if you think about it, Wesley Clair Mitchell wrote his first book in 1913. That was based on work that was done during the 1893, 1897, and 1907 depressions. So when we talk about the leading economic indicators and measuring economic prosperity, we need to be aware of their history because the research started directly upon all of America's experiences with bad recessions in 1893, which was the second worst recession in American history from 1854 to the current time. Only the Great Depression dwarfs the 1893 recession. And, we have to realize that the Federal Reserve despite all the criticism of the Fed, the Federal Reserve has done a great deal at moderating business cycles over the last 75 years. And 100 years with the Fed. And as you look at it, you want to be aware of how all the business cycle theory developed in conjunction with monetary theory. And it's extremely important. And the leading economic indicators were a great tool of it. Wesley Clair Mitchell, Arthur Burns, Jeffrey Moore, and Victor Zarnovich were the pioneers of the leading economic indicators. They were like the four horsemen of the leading economic indicators, if you want to put it into something that people can visualize. These were the four giants. Exactly. The Newt Rockney, if you would, of business cycles. And it's really important. And when I was doing this research, it was great because I was transitioning from my position as director of quantitative research at McKinley. I was teaching as an affiliate faculty member at the University of Washington. And I was teaching my quant book, and I was doing this book for the last 27 months of my transition. So I had plenty of time to do my transition in terms of buying a new house in Bluffton, South Carolina, doing a third edition of my quant finance book for Springer, and doing this book on economic indicators for Palgrave.
It's a good way to pass the time when you're in pandemic lockdowns.
It was. It was a great experience, a lot of fun.
Yeah. But you mentioned Burns and Mitchell and Moore and Zarnowitz, and Burns and Mitchell used to be household names at the time, and they are really giants. And you spend a lot of time speaking about Burns, Mitchell, Moore, and Zarnowitz in your book, and talking about their work, which clearly influenced you. Why did you spend so much time thinking about them?
Well, I wanted a book that would be a combination of economic history, the history of economic thought, and economic empiricism. And the reason I did that was for the following reason. I have very biased opinions on many topics. And Wesley Clair Mitchell was the first director of economic research at the NBER. And he was an avowed capitalist. And his book on business cycles has to do with expectations of profits. Now, as an economist, you would think, who is this guy talking about expectations of future profits? He was writing as if he were a businessman. He was the first director of the NBER. Now, one thing that really struck my interest that I did not know until I started doing that chapter 2 on Wesley Clair Mitchell was that Wesley Clair Mitchell was actually a researcher that worked on an applied problem. The president of the U.S. in 1923, which was Calvin Coolidge at the time, I believe, had a secretary of commerce named Herbert Hoover. Now, Herbert Hoover's going to appear in American history in a lot of economic examples. But in 1923, Wesley Clair Mitchell and Herbert Hoover arranged a conference on analyzing the 1921 recession, which was a very severe recession at that time. And they said, at Herbert Hoover's insistence, how can we make sure that these recessions do not happen again? And what public policy implications can we have? And how can we help the unemployed workers in a way that they don't feel like that society has completely forgotten them? Now, this is the same Herbert Hoover that's panned by the press for 1932. But in 1923, as Secretary of Commerce, when he had almost won the Nobel Peace Prize for distributing food to World War I refugees, is trying to work with Wesley Clair Mitchell. And who did they have working on this panel to understand unemployment? They had the chairman of General Motors, and they had the president of the AFL-CIO on the same committee. They had labor. They had industry. They had 3 CEOs from industry and the head of the AFL-CIO, and they all got together and they put out 150, well, it was actually about a 300-page volume, published by the NBER in 1923 on understanding unemployment in business cycles. So that was Wesley Clair Mitchell's second book. So this was all in terms of the NBER, which continued. Arthur Burns, whom we all know as the chairman of the Fed in the 1970s, was then a young graduate student with Wesley Clair Mitchell at Columbia. When Wesley Clair Mitchell dies, they do a book to honor Wesley Clair Mitchell. And Arthur Burns contacts one of his young graduate students at Columbia who has just finished his PhD, and he says, you had Wesley Clair Mitchell. What do you think? And this young man wrote a chapter in the NBER book dedicated to Wesley Clair Mitchell in 1951. Wesley Clair Mitchell, economic scientist. And he says, here's what Mr. Mitchell said in class. And here's, if you wanted to do a mathematical appendix, here is what I would offer as a mathematical appendix to understand Wesley Clair Mitchell from 1913 to 1946. And he wrote a 17-page appendix. This young graduate student had the name of Milton Friedman, whom you will hear about in economic history and practice. And that's how this book began. Geoffrey Moore was really important in this whole process because he and Victor Zarnovitz co-published, as you well know, 40 years of papers. Basically from 1961 to the death of Geoffrey Moore, circa 2000, they wrote together at the NBER. Now, when Geoffrey Moore passes away in 2000, they do a book to honor Geoffrey Moore. Actually, it started off as an Indian Economic Review composite journal, a big special issue. Who were the authors in that series? Well, there was a Victor Zarnovitz, there was a Lawrence Klein, the Nobel Prize winner from Wharton in the business school, the head of the Wharton School forecasting model. And there was David Hendry, and there was one practitioner named John Guerard that all contributed to that book in 2001. And what was my paper about? My paper showed that if you took the leading economic indicators in the U.S., could you forecast efficiently real GDP in the U.S.? And the answer was yes. And you could beat a random walk with drift model by a statistically significant amount by using the LEI as your input. So a transfer function model, a transfer function time series model. Now your first thought is, Ataman, who was using transfer functions to forecast? See, that's a really good question. And if you go back to Box and Jenkins, and you look at their 6 series of economic data in the appendix, you'll see that they had an example of forecasting with a leading indicator. If you go to the book by Clive Granger, his book on economic forecasting, he has a chapter, Forecasting with a Leading Indicator. And the LEI is the perfect leading indicator. And it's highly statistically correlated with real GDP.
So you're following a very long tradition on forecasting with the leading indicators, and you've developed your own models forecasting GDP with the leading index, and you've shown that it really helps to improve those forecasts.
Exactly.
Well, tell us a little bit about some of the pros and cons of those models.
Well, see, thank you. When I originally started this exercise, I had worked, first of all, McKinley Capital in Anchorage, Alaska was a subscriber to the LEI data the entire time I was director of research, because I thought you can't make an intelligent business decision without knowing what the LEI is. Why? Because you have to know what you expect of the economy. And I'll tell you, we had an experience that is a very pro experience. So we had a bad recession in 2007 and 8. And at that time, well, McKinley Capital has always been a global growth specialist, and we were concerned with forecasting momentum. And so my boss calls me in one day and he says, John, can we forecast momentum, particularly in global markets? And the answer is yes. Well, what do you do? When the LEI turns down, and down by more than 1.5 standard deviations, that is a leading indicator that the momentum factor return in U.S. and international markets will turn down in the next 6 to 9 months. So we're not, in finance and in portfolio selection, we can say, when does momentum turn down? When the LEI turns down, the momentum factor return will turn down. And that means that our methodology is going to have a tough time. But if you tell your clients, you know what, over the long run, momentum is a great factor return. And in international markets, it is the premier factor return. But you tell your clients, you know what, the LEI is turned down, and we're going to have some rough sledding the next 6 to 9 months. So if you've got your foot on the accelerator, might not be a bad time to kind of downshift a little bit. And so we showed in a paper I wrote with Jose Mencheros, who's now the director of portfolio analytics at Bloomberg, we showed that you could take your portfolio tilt and lower it a level, and it would enhance stockholder wealth. So you have to know when to put your foot on the gas and when to put your foot on the brake in portfolio selection.
And we have some great tools in that with the
LEI.
index.
The LEI will help you with the momentum exposure.
Can you talk a little bit more about applications of those
Sure.
forecasting models?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. I want to tell you what was really helpful in my book. When I was doing the book, I had the data at McKinley from 1959 to 2018. Actually, 2019, when I effectively transitioned to the Scientific Advisory Board. And so I had this data, and we had mined the data, and it's in chapter 7 of my book. And so we went through and I did all the regression analysis. I did ordinary least squares. I did all types of robust regression because I've always been big on outlier adjustment. Then I did the time series forecasting, and then I did robust time series. So what did I use for robust regression? I used SAS, and I used Oxmetrics, which is the David Hendry software package at Oxford University, at University of Oxford. And they fit outliers, and they help you guide your thought. Now, when I was doing SAS, I used SAS with the outliers. And when I found the outlier techniques were useful, very useful from 1959 to 2019, as I was doing the book, I contacted you and I said, Ataman, my friend, what about COVID? What about COVID? What should we be thinking about with COVID? If there's ever a time for outlier adjustments, oh, mon Dieu, this is it. This is it. And so what did we do? I contacted you and I said, can you give me a data update, a data refresh? And you did. And you gave me access to data from 1959 to November of 2020, which I greatly appreciated, and that became chapter 10 of the book. And I said, all right, now folk, all of you that are sitting there thinking, oh yeah, all this robust regression, how much of this is going to be relevant for COVID? Well, gather round, children, have your hot chocolate. Adults, perhaps something in the nature of a G&T, because when you look at the COVID period, the outliers are exacerbated. Oh my God. No. So now I did forecast real GDP, and I also forecasted the unemployment rate. Now we do the unemployment rate in chapter 7 and in chapter 10. So let me tell you about forecasting the unemployment rate in COVID, because if there is a better selling point for the LEI, I have never seen it. I guarantee you Victor would be rising up saying, oh, John, that's good. That's good. He would be so pleased. He said, all you have to do is follow my lead. Okay, so what paper am I referring to? Victor Zarnovitz publishes a paper. He published many papers, but he published a paper with Montgomery and Rui C. at the University of Chicago at the Booth School. Montgomery, C., Zarnovitz, and Chow at 1999, forecasting the U.S. unemployment rate in the Journal of the American Statistical Association, JASA. We all know JASA. It's the leading stat journal in the country, probably in the world, and it's been that way for 130 years. So they published this paper on forecasting the unemployment rate from 1947 to 1977. And they used the leading economic indicators, which gave you some forecasting improvement, but not as much as you might have thought. And they did all types of time series. They did transfer function models with the leading economic indicators and with weekly unemployment claims. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, I had done a paper with my co-author Demetrios Timakis of the University of Athens, and we published a paper in the IJF in 2004. And we found better forecasting improvement than even Victor did. And Victor read the paper. He said, I like this paper. And so we thanked Victor when we published our paper in 2004 in the IJF. Well, now we're coming back and we're saying, what about 20 years later? So we did it. We published our original paper 1959 to 2018 in the Cogent Economics and Finance online journal. And David Hendry had published there several papers on teaching econometrics and with his Oxmetrics package and all types of brilliant research that Hendry does. And so we then come to 2020, and we find that instead of having outliers of 3, standardized residuals of 3 in forecasting unemployment, we have a standardized residual of 29.7 in April of 2020 for forecasting the unemployment rate. Well, you're smiling and you know that was true. So you're sitting there and you're going, oh my goodness, yes. And so then your first thought was, well, was this helpful in forecasting the unemployment rate? So here's what you can do it. And the one thing that we both know about econometrics is there are seemingly endless models to solve the same problem. And some answers are better than others. But generally, as long as you're statistically significant, there are many answers to many questions, to the same question. And what we found was when we used the Oxmetrics analysis out of Oxford, we found significant improvement. And all the residual analysis and the outlier analysis that was important, all their saturation variables for looking at step functions, looking at for one-time occurrences, the impulse indicator variables and trend stationary, all those variables became far more relevant in the 1959 to 2020 period. And if we ended it in January of 2020, or whether we ended it in November of 2020, it made a difference. Why? Because the leading economic indicators were able to pick up the increase in unemployment and the decrease in unemployment with the forecasting methods. So it worked. And it worked. You beat a random walk with drift model by a very statistically significant event. And you take some of the work of Montgomery et al., and I refer to them as MZTT in the book, Montgomery, Zarnovich, Chow, C. and Chow. And our models are very good. In fact, Rui C. read one of our papers that is forthcoming now in the Wilmot magazine on doing even more work with this with Ron Chen at Rutgers and Han Zhao. And so, we keep doing models with really smart people, because when you use this data, you get really good results. And the models are statistically significant. And no forecasting model is perfect. No forecasting model is perfect. But all you can do is be statistically significant. If you're statistically significant, if you can drive down your Tiles inequality constraint, if you look at the Mincer-Zarnovich regressions, and if you can reduce your mean square error, your mean absolute error, from being 1 with a no change model to 0.7, if you can reduce it by 30%, 25-30%, you have to be happy. Victor would say that's highly statistically significant. Yes. And what techniques do it? Outlier adjustments, robust regression, and adaptive learning from my co-author. And when we put these together, it's number one, it's a lot of fun. Number two, it's highly statistically significant. And 3, we have something to say. And that's what we're all about. That's what we're interested in.
Right. This is all very fascinating and fun for forecasters and econometricians. But let's shift gears a little bit as we're coming towards the end of the podcast and talk about the latest economic environment. And given all the work that you've done with leading indicators and forecasting, we've gone through the great financial crisis, a very deep recession. We've gone through the global pandemic recession, a very deep contraction in the economy, outliers, a lot of outliers. And this came after a very long period of mild recessions.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Short recessions. So looking ahead, how are you seeing the current environment as we head into increasingly lowered forecasts about GDP growth? And here, even at the conference board, we think the economy is getting to a cusp of a recession towards the end of the year, in Q4 and beyond.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. You just came out and announced that it was your 5th consecutive month of LEI decline. Is that true? In the U.S.?
July, yes.
Yes. Now, see, I will give you an answer in two parts. Number one, we are clearly in a low growth or no growth economic environment where we may be for some time. Now, when I look at the LEI do not indicate a recession. They do not indicate that I would be stopping. I haven't seen the LEI fall to the point yet where I would be putting my foot on the brakes of medium-term momentum yet in a portfolio scheme. However, you have to, the NBER will make the call on whether there's a recession or not. But if I'm sitting here thinking, first quarter was negative, second quarter was negative, was there a revision announced yesterday? Okay, it's supposed to be announced, I think, today or Monday. But in any event, let's assume that that's still negative. The third quarter GDP as forecast real time by the Atlanta Fed just came out today, and it's positive around 1.5%. Not great, but not negative. So let's assume that there's a little bit of political strategy involved. Let's assume nobody really wants to declare a recession in September with an election coming up in November. Let's just assume that everybody says, well, it's not really a bona fide recession. It's just a slowdown in growth, because I don't believe the NBER will call a recession so near to a...
Well, they're going to at least wait a year before...
Oh, I know. Just remember what Victor Zarnovitz wrote in 1991 in his paper with Jeffrey Moore. By the time they call a recession, the recession's half over to start with. That's what Victor said. Exactly. Victor said, you got to be careful with these things, because if you wait for them to blow the whistle, you've missed the bus. Now, here's a more important answer. So my first answer to you is it's probably low growth or no growth for the next year or two. But there's a more important question. You see, I work on Wall Street as a director of research for years. And there's a more important question to me than that, and that's what's going to happen to the stock market. Now, let me tell you what I think is going to happen to the stock market, because that's related to your question. See, we know that when the leading economic indicators turn down, that tells you the stock prices usually go down in the next 2 to 5 months. But the question is, how bad will they go down? So let me give you a statistic that I thought about, and that we actually presented at Oxford at the International Symposium on Forecasting in July. A new data source became available in January. I'm reading this white paper that came out of S&P, the S&P Global Index research staff, and I thought, interesting. And they had a comparison of the Dow and the S&P for the last 60 years and how similar they were. So I wrote the author. I said, wow, what a great paper. Do you have this historic data? He says, how far back do you want to go? I said, what about 1896? And he says, yes, I have it. So I received the data from May of 1896, when the Dow started, to February of 2022, okay? And I got the S&P data for the 60 years the S&P's been around. What did we do? What have I done with this? And this is my co-author, Demetrius Tamakis. We started modeling the data in 5-year increments. And I presented this at the ISF at Oxford. And here's what the implications are, the following. Every period in American history has outliers. Substantial every 5-year period has substantial outliers. From 1896, because you had the Depression of 1897, the Spanish-American War. What about in 2000, 2005? Well, you have the recession of 1904 with the Pacific Northern case, the Supreme Court decision that leads to an economic recession. 1907 screws up that 5-year period. What about the Great Depression? What about the recession of 1947? Every 5-year period has a recession. What's my point? All right, if you look at it, and I was thinking out loud. It was about June 25th, 26th. I was so waiting for the quarter to end, and I thought, what would my audience want to know about this? They don't want to know about the data year to date. They want to see the data end on June 30th, 2022. They want to see the 6-month period. And the Dow is down 15.31%. On a price basis, total return basis, a little bit different than that. So it's down 15.31%. NASDAQ's down about 29%. And your first question is, how does this compare to the past? So I look at the 6 months ended June 30th, and I compare it, Demetrius and I compared it to the data from 1896 to 2022, the 253 semi-annual periods. 126 years, 253 semi-annual periods. Now, Ataman, I'm going to ask you a friendly question. Where do you think the 6 months ended June 30th, 2022 compared, those 6 months when it's down 15%, to the entire history of the Dow? How many periods, how many 6 month periods were probably worse?
I hope that's a rhetorical question.
I'll cheat and give you the answer. It was only the 21st worst semi-annual period. The 21st worst. Well, if you're down 15%, you know what your first thought is? You go in and you tell your mom, Mom, your stocks are only down 15.31%. And she says, Lord, compared to what? Well, there have been 21 periods that were worse. It's been worse, a lot worse. However, 21 out of 253 puts you in the upper decile of stock recessions for 6 months. So it's really bad, but not worse. Worser, as they say down home. So it's bad, but it could have been worse. Now, so here's the next question. Your first thought is, well, what has happened in those 21 other periods? And the answer is stock prices have appreciated dramatically over the next 3 years. So my thought to you, my suggestion, Ataman, is, don't sell your house and move to a pup tent and save your money. No, you're going to be good. You're going to be good. Capitalism will continue. This is not the end of all stocks. It's a good time to have a gin and tonic and say, you know what? It's been bad, but it's going to get better, because 3 years from now, I expect the Dow to be sitting at 35,000. I expect 3 years from now. There are going to be a lot of people that say, are we going to have a recession? We may. Will they declare it? If there's a recession that we're in now, it wouldn't be declared till February anyway. Victor Zarnovich says, the average recession lasts 11 months in the post-war period. And they don't declare them until they're 7 months into them. You've almost escaped it when they call them. And what about the boom times? The average boom time is something like 54 months. So you have 54 months of good times and 10 months of bad. That's a pretty good ratio. Just remember this. When I graduated from college at Duke, when I finished my undergraduate school in December of 1974, the Dow was under 1,000. Under 1,000. And the return on the Dow has historically been around 7.5% for the 126 years. 7.5% is the Dow appreciation. So with dividends, it's probably closer to 10 over the last 126 years. So I fully expect that the Dow will be back on its normal course and everyone will be happy. But I will say this, the COVID experience is a great thing for statistical modeling, because there's never been a better period for outliers.
So regardless of the outliers, you're still optimistic about the...
I'm always optimistic, and yes, it's optimistic. And if you read the book by Jeffrey Siegel, Stocks for the Long Run, or as his critics will say, Stocks for the long run, he's very bullish too. And I'm convinced that, that the stock market will do very well. People will be happy. It's a great buying opportunity.
Well, that's a great place to end on an optimistic note. This was a great discussion about John Guerard's latest book, The Leading Economic Indicators and Business Cycles in the United States, 100 Years of Empirical Evidence and the Opportunities for the Future. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our off-the-shelf book discussion podcast series, or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at www.conference-board.org/podcast.
Thank you so much, Ataman.
Thanks, John. Great to have you here.
This has been Off the Shelf, a podcast by the Conference Board.